while we are still waiting for the questions from the audience, the moderator always had the privilege to ask the first questions, right? So I guess the three papers will cover quite different things, quite diverse things. But as we know, ecology is something, everything is related to everything. So I guess, there must be some interconnectivity, among all the presentations. So, yeah, we got the questions. But let me first ask the question first. For Carlos, as far as I understand, your presentation, I thought, your main argument is about how the non-state actors, can somehow come up with some sort of space or room or autonomy, to maneuver even in a very tightening situation in China. But when you come to the later part of your presentations, you talk about Tesla. I guess that is everything. That's the things on the news. And from the American perspective, kind of Tesla is once Elon Musk try to kind of privatize Twitter, then the Americans worry that they would be under the China's influence and all that. However, if we put things in perspective, China is always the one who worry that they are subjected to the external influences. So I guess there are two things that in your presentation. The first, okay, you said okay, at least China still has a possibility to be subjected to the external influence, like to be subjected to the non-state kind of actors' influence. But then when you come to the concluding part, it seems like it turns into the other way around. Have I understood you correctly, or do you want to further develop your point here, Carlos?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question and the opportunity to sort of elaborate a little bit more. Just very briefly, you in your question, you started off by, I guess, sort of rephrasing my thesis, as you understood it, saying that I was trying to find a space or carve out a space for sort of non-state actors within China. I was actually not so much trying to do that, but rather to complicate the distinction between state and non-state actors in the first place, right? In my original understanding of the sort of call for papers, which differed a little bit from the introduction that you gave at the beginning of this session, I understood that you were sort of framing the conference around an interest not so much in sort of state-driven environmental initiatives, rather initiatives driven by non-state actors. And I guess I was trying to sort of use a set of environmental or ecological sort of concepts or approaches to sort of complicate or problematize that binary, right? And not only that binary, but also the ones between economic and non-economic sort of factors, and between domestic and foreign factors. So yeah, so to go back to your the final part of your question, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, that's sort of precisely my point, that with the Tesla thing, we're kind of thinking of it in terms of Tesla as a foreign entity, versus China, whether Tesla has the upper hand or whether China has the upper hand, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess I was trying to suggest that if we use a sort of ecological approach to think about it, that they're really much more tightly intertwined than I think we necessarily want to acknowledge, right? That Tesla's fate and China's sort of economic and environmental, the fate of China's economy and its environmental initiative are not as dissociable or as separable as I think we would or the media often would like us to think, and that has in turn has implications for a lot of other seemingly unrelated issues, including the whole question about the fate of Twitter, right? Or be that as it may. So yeah. So I mean, I was not really trying to position it as sort of one or the other, but rather to say that the same way that within a lot of environmental issues, things are intertwined at a very deep level that often it's very hard to sort of separate things out. that the same thing happens at the level of these socio-political and economic initiatives and sort of phenomena.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, yeah, I got it. Well, just but in a kind of we are somewhat in a new Cold War 2.0. Well, so somehow I guess the world is getting more and more dichotomized these days.
Yeah, except the whole concept of Cold War is an us versus them, right? It's a binarized vision of the world order, whereas, yeah, arguably during the Cold War and certainly at this present time, a lot of those binaries really break down if you look at them, with any degree of attention.
Right. Thanks a lot, Well. And that comment somehow, kind of associate with the very first kind of statement made by Feng in his presentation. I guess, I remember you said, Feng, you said, ecologizing, at least, in the context you have been discussing, is somewhat, equivalent to colonizing. So it goes quite against, the way how Bruno Latour, in one of his early essays, to talk about ecologization. For him, to ecologize always means, to go beyond, that dichotomy of modernity and all that, right? But when you kind of ask us, to associate ecologizations, with colonizations, then you try to turn us back to this binary opposition, or what's the implications, of your argument?
Me, right? Okay. I haven't thought that far yet along the line of the binarism, but I think it's pretty clear that all the at least in the performing arts that we're seeing so far over the first 2 decades of the new century, this whole ecologization of traditional music and performing arts has been working under a not more liberal but tightened state control of what is sanctioned and what is not, what is desired and what is not desired. And the taste changes, but it's also dictated by, among many things, the market, but also, I mean, the market of the middle class Han Chinese from Shanghai and Beijing and all those, but also the desirability of certain styles and certain elements, musical elements in the whole scheme of the state's projects of all these minority performing arts and positioning. So who gets to be listed as an artist of the original ecology style, they get a subsidy every month and all those things, is really much a political decision as much as something that is aesthetic. And yeah, so that in that sense, I think that is very important to think about these ecologization as adding another layer of control rather than liberalizing. And the agency is not there as well. But can I answer Rena's question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, she wrote something very exciting, and if you haven't read it, please read it. This is exactly where I'm getting to, and thanks very much for bringing that. So there are basically 2 things, and I'll just talk about these very briefly. So again, yes, the first is the idea of primitivism, and it's very much exactly what's going on here. You know, the Dolan example that I show, the soaring voices and improvisatory impulses, all of these contrast sharply with the kind of the modernist and refined style of singing. A kind of a perceived wilderness and connection to the natural world actually invite a lot of Chinese scholars to speculate the Dolan's connection with the hunting culture. Very funny, yeah. All those shit, you know, prehistorical human societies, which retained certain sense of nomadism that mark it distinct from other Uyghur and other more advanced cultures. You know, remnants of uncontaminated tradition that has been lost, and in modernization, therefore should be safeguarded. Yeah, all these things are still clocked in that language of primordial authenticity and and in order to make them relevant in the modern kind of discourses, and yeah, that's where it operates in that sense. And also, this continue to be constructed upon a sense of primitivism, which, despite being somewhat positively received under this whole original ecology frame, remain problematic if they look or sound excessively similar to other modern traditions. So in other words, that gaze is very much there. And number two, of course, I agree with you 100%. This word minority is super problematic. Again, I wrote it and I said it many times. I generally avoid the term minority to refer to the specific nationalities and ethnicity identified as such in China. Uyghur, Tibetans, and other non-Han peoples are the majority of their homeland. And there's nothing minor about their art and music and culture. It's deeply problematic. Minoritizing discourses, and whenever I use it, I use it in that way.
Okay, good. Well, while we are still waiting for a few more questions, from the audience, maybe I have a response to Emily. It's not necessarily a question, but maybe you can somehow react to my kind of comments. It's not necessarily a comment, even. So when your topic is about multi-species, but the text, you use the examples you use in your argument is mainly you kind of categorize the three examples into body meats, body plants, body soil. So I wonder, how would you categorize, the term species, because the way how conventional understanding would be, they are at least species, refers to some living organism, but then meat, is a dead meat, I suppose, then, and plant, and also soil, probably they belongs to a different category. So how would you kind of put all these things under the category of multi-species? How would you come up with this term to describe all these three different texts, visual as well as written text?
Yeah, thanks so much for the comment, Casey. So here, multi-species, right? So it's species plus multi. So the multi means, all these species come together as a whole life world. So in my presentation, I emphasize, for example, life ways, life words, live ability. So even though I talk about the body meat, there is this idea about how meat, as a symbol, or to think metaphorically in terms of vulnerability, in terms of consumption, predation, and how that mediates the human-animal relationships, for example, in Hollywood, Hong Kong, and then human-plant relationships, and human-soil relationships. How I think in your story, you consider soil as a whole multi-species life world, which is the whole holistic ecosystem where different species, they could exist in a more or less, produce the abundance of life in a matrix. So with their relational network. So relationality and species, that's how I approach multi-species as one word. Yeah, and how, even I think in Hollywood, Hong Kong, and Bitter Melon, they're more sort of approached in a more allegorical way, while in your story, it's more like a materialistic, like a really, dealing with the soil and the life forms. Yeah, but in Bitter Melon, for example, even though their multi-species life forms has gone, they're forgetting of it. People constantly remember it, and they're being haunted. They continue to shape, people's everyday lives, their bodies, their materiality, their landscapes. So it still has a very much material effect, and it's not just gone, forever gone. And so it has these traces, and they continue to shape the heterogeneous realities of that I want to emphasize. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So is there any questions from the audience? Any comments?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah, or maybe the speakers can ask questions to one another, in case.
Yeah, so I have a question for Carlo. Yeah, just from your sort of cross mapping of these frameworks of activism, environmental activism in China. I wonder where does the actual the people who receive such activist intervention, they react back to these frameworks. I have one example in my mind. That's about this little town called Guiyu, which is the e-waste recycling hub, right? It's very infamous, everyone knows it. And it's a very big example for the international NGOs like the Basel Convention Network to go there to advocate for activism. But when they actually go there, it's so complex because it's got the local migrant workers, the local people, the authority, and then the international NGOs. And sometimes the NGOs, they are hated by the local people. So the local people suffer from the environmental destruction, but they also very much depend on this e-waste, for their own economic livelihood. So some, for example, anthropologists, scholars, and also NGOs, they get on the ground. Sometimes the local people like very suspicious and even try to get them out, drive them out. So I wonder how that sort of grounds up actor of the local people, or even the Tesla factory migrant workers. How do they come into this mega framework that you laid out here? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily, for your question and also for your presentation. I have I guess a partial response to your question, but then can also sort of fold it back to a question I had about your talk that I think speaks to a similar issue or the same issue. So yeah, the Guiyu example is really interesting. And I've actually, there's a mainland Chinese sci-fi author, San Chen Xiufan, whose first novel, Huang Chao, is set in a fictionalized version of Guiyu, which is near his own hometown. And yeah, I mean, this is a good example of how there can appear to be sort of competing interests between a set of locals that are struggling for survival and to sort of eke out a kind of a subsistence level living, or to increase their sort of base level sort of income versus a set of national and even global economic forces. And Guiyu achieved its status due to a set of both sort of national priorities, trying to for a period encourage China to be kind of a destination site for e-waste recycling, but then also to a set of globalized factors as well. A lot of other nations sort of declining to want to deal with this sort of waste, but at the same time generating sort of vast amounts of economic or electronic sort of commodities that would then be quickly need to be disposed of. But the question that you raised, I think, is really interesting. Actually, it relates to a question I had about your presentation, so I might fold it back to you. In the presentation, right before you moved into your discussion of the three main texts, or the two stories in the film, you had that image of the protesters protesting the high-speed rail construction, which I think is, and I didn't quite catch how that was linked. I don't think it was not linked to your three source texts, so I didn't quite catch how that was linked up to your main argument. But I think that kind of really crystallizes some of the questions that you're raising to me, right? Because in many places, high-speed rail is environmentally productive overall, right? I mean, it decreases the reliance on other modes of transportation, which are usually much more impactful in terms of sort of reliance on fossil fuels and sort of overall environmental impact. And so, so in the broad scheme of things, high-speed rail, I think, is sort of a net positive in many cases. On the other hand, you have a kind of an NIMBY kind of opposition that often arises, not NIMBY, not in my backyard, right? That sort of a resistance on the part of local communities that would be disproportionately impacted by the high-speed rail construction, which I think is what was happening in that image that you were showing us. And so I think that that's a sort of a good example of the question I think that you're posing to me of a tension between individuals or local communities on the one hand, and the way that they understand their sort of relative interests versus a set of larger projects that have a larger net gain or net positive impact in terms of their consequences for the environment, and how to negotiate that, right? Because you can universally positively impact everyone, and it's simply a fact that with a lot of these large projects, certain individuals or communities will be disproportionately impacted in a negative manner for the sake of the quote unquote greater good.
Yeah, thanks so much for that comment, Carlos. Exactly. I mean, that image, because the Peter Mann story and the Farming in the City story, they both reference this land movement of state, the Chaoran village movement. Yeah. So I then really, this is very interesting. Like for our two comments coming together, I think there is this emphasis on, how the local and also the national sometimes kind of can be different from the local, right? And the global. And also on the very ground, I think a more like a sort of radical and non-anthropocentric framework might also take into consideration of how the non-human, such as the land in my presentation, or such as for example, the e-waste in Guiyu, how that entangled with the human, the local, the migrant workers who will touch it, and how they perceive those non-human agencies as resources to be recycled or as waste to be thrown away. So for example, the NGOs might see them as environmental pollutants, and these local workers might see it as economic livelihood. Yeah. So yeah, and also I think that Hong Kong also adds some. So for these cases of land movements or environmentalism, it also adds a lot of local specificity into the question. For example, in Hong Kong, those villagers who are protesting, in Hong Kong, there is those indigenous land laws, for example, dating back to the British colonization period. But also those people who are actually protesting in this movement are mainly non-indigenous villagers. They have been, building this land, farming this land for 4 decades, and then they have to move away because they're non-indigenous, not entitled to this land rights. So from that case, I guess it has lots of local factors that comes into play. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thanks. Well, Feng, you have something to say?
Yes, somebody should elaborate on what I'm going to say. And I don't think this is right, Carlos. The understanding of that, support of that, the opposition to the high-speed railway in 2008 and 2009 in Hong Kong, the opposition was precisely to the impact of this high-speed railway on the environment, building one tiny short distance of 17 kilometers, and not only spending up that amount of money, but also digging that deep into the ground and destroying so many things for that 17 kilometers. And it's not helping this railway, it's not helping the speed of the railway, it's not helping anything that we imagine to be alleviating the impact of the environment. So it's not, and also the vast majority of the people who are opposed to that is also not somebody who had any interest in the land in northwestern Hong Kong. And so that kind of conventional dichotomy, I think, does not apply to the case of the opposition of the high-speed railway in Hong Kong. We're not seeing something similar to for example, in California or some other places. And those, or somewhere in the middle of nowhere in China, those villages being demolished for high-speed railway construction. And nothing similar to that. The whole logic is not that. And again, those of you who are more involved could elaborate on that. Yeah.
Just very briefly, and thank you for that. I didn't, as I said, when I responded to Emily, I missed the lead into that discussion, so I was responding more to the image. But yeah, I'm well aware of the controversy over the high-speed rail link into Hong Kong and the way in which this was a politically driven attempt to sort of consolidate the mainland sort of control over Hong Kong. And so your points are completely well taken. On the other hand, I mean, I think that example in the abstract replicated a number of sort of NIMBY types of arguments, including the one that you just referenced in terms of California, right? Where I think it's empirically obvious that having high-speed rail in California, the same way that one has in the rest of the civilized world, would be a net economic positive, but is being opposed by a lot of sort of local opposition, or in other places too, where there's high-speed rail arguably would be a sort of a net benefit for the region as a whole, but then is opposed by localized forces that feel that it would disproportionately impact them. And in many cases, that's true. And yeah, I missed the lead in to Emily's discussion of that image, and I'm well aware of the debate over that precise sort of 17 miles, whatever, link of the mainland to Hong Kong. And so your points are well taken.
Great. Well, I guess
Okay.
we have a pretty fruitful exchange. And thanks again, for 3 wonderful presentations and very productive discussions. Well, thanks again, for our 3 speakers. Waking up at the night, I guess was close to night, right? I guess we're still early, right, on the East Coast and in Midwest.
No, we sleep very early in the Midwest.
Oh, yeah, okay. So sorry about you, make you stay awake. Okay, then since if you this time want to stay late, you're welcome to join our second panel that would take place in 25 minutes. So once again, thanks for all our 3 speakers for their wonderful presentations. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So please join us again for the others audience. Please join us again in 25 minutes. We will have a second panel forthcoming. Thanks. Okay. Bye-bye.